Marcus Thompson walked through the gates of Randolph Air Force Base with his chest puffed out and his head held high. At 22 years old, he carried himself like someone who had already conquered the world. His father had been a decorated fighter pilot, and his grandfather before him had served in World War II. Flying was in his blood, or so he believed. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as Marcus made his way to the orientation building. He had graduated top of his class from the Air Force Academy, and his test scores were among the highest in his recruitment batch. In his mind, he was destined for greatness, meant to follow in the footsteps of the great male pilots who had shaped military aviation history. As he entered the briefing room, Marcus scanned the other recruits. Most were men like himself, young, confident, and eager to prove themselves. But then his eyes fell on something that made him frown. 3 women sat among the group wearing the same flight suits as everyone else. One of them, a petite brunette with sharp green eyes, was reviewing flight manuals with intense concentration. Marcus rolled his eyes and muttered to his new bunkmate Jake Patterson, who had taken the seat beside him. "Great, they're letting anyone fly these days. Hope they can handle the pressure when things get real." Jake shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He had grown up with 3 sisters and knew better than to underestimate women, but he also didn't want to start any trouble on his first day. The woman with the green eyes looked up from her manual. She had heard Marcus's comment, but instead of responding, she simply returned to her reading. Her nameplate read Collins, and there was something about her posture and focus that suggested she was far from a typical rookie. During the first week of training, Marcus made it his mission to prove his superiority. When the female recruits struggled with the heavy equipment, he would laugh loudly and make comments about how they should be in the kitchen instead of the cockpit. When they asked questions during technical briefings, he would whisper to nearby recruits about how women just didn't have the natural understanding of machinery that men possessed. Collins, the woman he had first noticed, became his primary target. She was quiet, methodical, and seemed to take everything seriously. To Marcus, this made her an easy mark for his jokes and cutting remarks. "Hey, Collins," Marcus called out one afternoon as they prepared for flight simulation training. "You sure you can reach the pedals in that cockpit? Maybe they should install some phone books for you." Several male recruits chuckled nervously, but Collins simply adjusted her helmet and continued her pre-flight checks. Her silence only encouraged Marcus further. "I'm just saying," he continued, now addressing the group, "when we're in actual combat situations, we can't have pilots who need bathroom breaks every hour or who might get emotional under pressure. Some jobs are just meant for men." This time, a few of the other recruits frowned. Sarah Martinez, one of the other female pilots, started to respond, but Collins put a gentle hand on her arm and shook her head slightly. The training intensified as weeks passed. Physical conditioning, flight simulations, tactical training, and endless hours of studying filled their days. Marcus excelled in most areas, as he had expected. But something strange began to happen. Collins consistently scored at the top of every test, both written and practical. Her flight simulations were flawless, her tactical knowledge was extensive, and her physical conditioning scores rivaled those of the strongest male recruits. This only irritated Marcus more. During mess hall conversations, he would openly question how she was getting such high scores. "Must be nice to get special treatment," he would say loud enough for her to hear. "I bet the instructors are going easy on the diversity hires." The other recruits began to distance themselves from Marcus as his behavior became increasingly unpleasant. Even Jake, his original ally, started sitting at different tables during meals. But Marcus was too focused on his own perceived superiority to notice the growing isolation. One particularly challenging day, the recruits were put through a complex navigation exercise. They had to fly solo in simulators through hostile territory, making split-second decisions while managing multiple system failures. It was designed to test their ability to think under extreme pressure. Marcus felt confident as he climbed into his simulator. This was the kind of challenge where his natural talents would shine. He began the exercise aggressively, pushing his virtual aircraft to its limits. But as complications mounted and systems began failing, he found himself overwhelmed. His aggressive approach backfired, and he crashed his simulated aircraft twice before finally completing the mission with a barely passing score. Collins, on the other hand, completed the exercise with the highest score in the class. Her approach had been measured, calculated, and incredibly effective. She had anticipated problems before they occurred and had backup plans for every contingency. As they exited the simulators, Marcus was furious. His face was red with embarrassment and anger. "This whole thing is rigged," he announced to anyone who would listen. "There's no way she could have scored that high without help. The instructors probably gave her all the answers beforehand." Collins walked past him toward the debriefing room, still silent. Her expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes, not anger, but perhaps disappointment. It was the look of someone who had seen this kind of behavior many times before. That evening in the barracks, Marcus continued his tirade. He complained to anyone who would listen about unfair advantages, lowered standards, and political correctness ruining the military. Most of the other recruits had stopped paying attention to him entirely, but he was too wrapped up in his own narrative to notice. What Marcus didn't know was that his behavior had been carefully observed and documented. Military instructors were trained to watch for recruits who couldn't work as part of a team or who showed disrespect for fellow service members. His attitude toward the female pilots was creating exactly the kind of divisive environment that could be dangerous in real combat situations. As the training program entered its final phase, the recruits were told they would be meeting some distinguished visitors, former pilots and current military leaders who would be evaluating their progress and potential for advanced training assignments. Marcus saw this as his opportunity to shine. Finally, he would be evaluated by people who understood what real military excellence looked like, people who would recognize his natural leadership qualities and his dedication to traditional military values. He spent extra time polishing his uniform and practicing his most confident posture. This was going to be his moment to prove that he belonged among the elite pilots of the Air Force. But as he prepared for what he thought would be his triumph, Marcus remained completely unaware of the shock that awaited him. The truth about Collins was about to be revealed, and it would shatter everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy, respect, and what it truly meant to be an elite pilot. The morning of the evaluation arrived with crisp autumn air and clear skies. Marcus stood in formation with the other recruits, his uniform pressed to perfection and his confidence at an all-time high. Today would be the day he distinguished himself from the rest of the class, especially from Collins and the other female pilots who he believed had been given unfair advantages. The base commander, Colonel Williams, addressed the formation first. "Today, you'll be evaluated by some of the finest pilots and military leaders in our nation's history. These officers have served with distinction in multiple theaters of operation, and their assessment will determine your next assignment." Marcus straightened his shoulders even more. This was exactly what he had been preparing for his entire life. "First," Colonel Williams continued, "I'd like to introduce General Patricia Hayes, who has over 3,000 flight hours in combat zones and currently serves as Deputy Commander of Air Combat Command." A tall woman in dress uniform stepped forward. Her chest was covered with ribbons and medals that told the story of a distinguished career. Marcus was impressed despite himself, though he couldn't help but think that she was probably the exception that proved the rule about women in combat roles. Next, we have General Robert Chen, former Thunderbirds pilot and current head of pilot training for the Pacific Theater. General Chen stepped forward, his bearing impeccable and his reputation well known among the recruits. "Finally," Colonel Williams said, "we have General Elizabeth Collins, who holds the distinction of being the youngest person ever promoted to general officer rank in the Air Force. She has commanded fighter squadrons in 3 different conflicts and currently oversees all advanced tactical training programs. Marcus felt his blood run cold. The name hit him like a physical blow. Collins. It couldn't be a coincidence. He looked toward where the female recruits stood in formation, but from his position he couldn't see Collins clearly. General Elizabeth Collins stepped forward, and Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. It was her. The quiet, petite woman he had been tormenting for weeks was a general. Not just any general, but apparently one of the most accomplished pilots in Air Force history. The woman he had mocked, insulted, and dismissed was wearing the stars of a general officer. Her uniform displayed ribbons for valor, combat service, distinguished flying crosses, and commendations that Marcus could only dream of earning. His mouth went completely dry. The blood drained from his face, and he felt dizzy. Every cruel comment, every mocking laugh, every dismissive gesture came flooding back to him. He had been harassing a general officer. He had questioned her abilities, suggested she didn't belong in the military, and made jokes about her competence. General Collins began to speak, her voice carrying the same calm authority Marcus had witnessed during training, but now he understood where that confidence came from. Recruits, your performance over the past several weeks has been carefully monitored. We've evaluated not just your technical skills, but your character, your ability to work as part of a team, and your respect for fellow service members. Marcus wanted to disappear. He wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. The realization of what he had done was crushing. He had spent weeks proving himself to be exactly the kind of officer the Air Force didn't want. Military service requires trust, General Collins continued. Trust in your wingman, trust in your commanding officers, and trust in the chain of command. When that trust breaks down, people die. She paused and looked directly at the formation. Though she didn't single out Marcus specifically, he felt as though her words were aimed directly at him. After the formal introduction, the recruits were divided into small groups for individual evaluations. Marcus found himself assigned to a group that would be interviewed by General Collins herself. His hands shook as he waited for his turn. When his name was called, Marcus marched forward and saluted. General Collins returned his salute professionally, but her expression was unreadable. "At ease, Recruit Thompson," she said, gesturing for him to sit across from her at a simple table that had been set up in the briefing room. Marcus sat rigidly, afraid to move or speak. General Collins reviewed his file for a moment before looking up at him. "You have excellent test scores," she began. "Your flight simulation results show natural talent, and your academic performance is impressive." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. "However," General Collins continued, "there are some concerning reports about your interactions with fellow recruits. Would you like to explain your behavior during the training program?" This was it. This was where his military career ended before it had even begun. Marcus struggled to find words, his mind racing through possible explanations or excuses, but every excuse seemed pathetic in light of what he now knew. "General, Marcus started, then stopped. There was no excuse. There was no explanation that would make his behavior acceptable. General Collins waited patiently for him to continue. "I was wrong," Marcus finally managed to say. "I said and did things that were inappropriate and unprofessional. I have no excuse for my behavior." "What specifically do you believe you did wrong?" General Collins asked. Marcus took a shaky breath. "I made assumptions about people based on their gender. I was disrespectful to fellow recruits. I questioned their abilities without any justification. I created a hostile environment for other service members." General Collins nodded slowly. "Do you understand why this behavior is problematic in a military context?" "Yes, ma'am. Because military units have to function as teams. Because lives depend on trust and mutual respect. Because prejudice and discrimination have no place in defending our country." Marcus paused, then continued with growing conviction. And because I was completely wrong about the abilities of the people I was criticizing, I let my own arrogance blind me to the truth. General Collins studied him carefully. What do you think should happen to you now? Marcus met her eyes, though it was one of the hardest things he had ever done. Honestly, General, I think I should be dismissed from the program. My behavior was unacceptable, and I've proven that I'm not ready to serve alongside other airmen with the respect and professionalism they deserve. The room fell silent for a long moment. General Collins made some notes in his file, her expression still unreadable. "Recruit Thompson," she finally said, "in my 20-year military career, I've encountered many officers who held similar attitudes to yours. Some never learned from their mistakes. Others became some of the finest officers I've ever served with." Marcus waited, hardly daring to breathe. "The difference," she continued, "was whether they could genuinely change their perspective or whether they simply learned to hide their prejudices better." She closed his file and looked at him directly. "Your honest admission of wrongdoing suggests that you might be capable of real growth. But words are easy, Recruit Thompson. Actions are what matter." Marcus felt a tiny flicker of hope, but he was afraid to let it grow. "You will complete this training program," General Collins said, "but you will do so under close observation. Any further incidents of disrespectful behavior toward fellow recruits will result in immediate dismissal. More importantly, you will spend the remainder of your training period learning about the history of women in military service and the contributions they have made to our national defense." Marcus nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for this opportunity." General Collins stood, signaling that the interview was over. As Marcus prepared to leave, she spoke once more. "Recruit Thompson, I want you to understand something. I didn't reveal my rank during training because I wanted to see how recruits would behave when they thought no one important was watching. Character isn't what you do when you're trying to impress your superiors. Character is what you do when you think nobody who matters is paying attention." Marcus saluted and left the room, his mind reeling from everything that had transpired. As he walked back to the barracks, he realized that his military education was just beginning, and it had nothing to do with flying. Marcus spent the next 3 days in a state of deep reflection and research. General Collins had assigned him to write a comprehensive report on women in military aviation, and what began as a punishment quickly became an eye-opening education that changed his entire perspective. He learned about the women Air Force service pilots of World War II, brave women who flew military aircraft in dangerous conditions despite facing constant discrimination. He read about Jacqueline Cochran, who broke the sound barrier and set more aviation records than any pilot of her era. He discovered stories of women who had served with distinction in conflicts around the world, often while facing the same kind of prejudice he had displayed. But the story that affected him most was General Collins's own biography. As he researched her background, Marcus discovered that she had overcome obstacles he had never imagined. She had grown up in poverty, worked multiple jobs to pay for flight training, and had faced years of discrimination and harassment during her rise through the ranks. Despite all of this, she had become one of the most respected tactical pilots in the Air Force. The more he learned, the more ashamed Marcus became of his behavior. But alongside the shame came a growing determination to change. His first opportunity to prove himself came during a group training exercise. The recruits were working on a complex formation, flying simulation that required perfect coordination between multiple pilots. Marcus found himself assigned to fly wingman for Sarah Martinez, one of the women he had previously dismissed. In the past, Marcus would have complained about the assignment or made jokes about having to rely on a female pilot. Instead, he focused entirely on being the best wingman possible. He followed her lead precisely, communicated clearly, and supported her decisions without question. When the simulation ended, Their team had achieved one of the highest scores in the exercise. As they climbed out of their simulators, Marcus approached Sarah. "That was excellent flying," he said sincerely. "Your tactical decisions were spot on, especially during the emergency scenario." Sarah looked at him suspiciously, clearly wondering if this was some kind of setup for another cruel joke. "I'm serious," Marcus continued. "I've been an idiot and I owe you an apology. You're a better pilot than I am, and I should have recognized that from the beginning instead of making assumptions based on things that don't matter." Sarah studied his face carefully, then nodded slowly. "Apology accepted. But actions speak louder than words, Thompson." "I understand," Marcus replied. "I hope I can earn back your respect and trust." Over the following weeks, Marcus worked harder than he had ever worked in his life. Not just on his flying and technical skills, but on becoming the kind of person who deserved to serve alongside the exceptional pilots in his training class. He studied the leadership styles of the female recruits, observing how Collins approached problems with methodical precision, how Martinez showed exceptional situational awareness, and how Jennifer Walsh demonstrated remarkable calm under pressure. Instead of looking for flaws to mock, he looked for strengths to learn from. When newer recruits joined the training program, Marcus made it his mission to ensure they understood the importance of mutual respect from day one. When he overheard another recruit making disparaging comments about women pilots, Marcus firmly but respectfully corrected him, sharing some of what he had learned about the history and achievements of women in aviation. The real test came during the final week of training. The recruits were put through a series of high-pressure scenarios designed to simulate real combat conditions. These exercises would determine their final rankings and future assignments. During one particularly challenging scenario, Collins found herself in a simulated emergency situation. Her flight computer malfunctioned during a complex tactical maneuver, leaving her flying on instruments only while navigating through hostile territory. Marcus, flying in a support position, immediately recognized the danger. Without hesitation, he moved to provide tactical support, calling out navigation points and potential threats while maintaining his own flight path. His assistance was flawless, allowing Collins to complete the mission successfully despite the equipment failure. After the debriefing, Colonel Williams approached Marcus privately. "That was exceptional flying, Thompson, and exceptional teamwork. General Collins specifically noted your performance in her evaluation." Marcus felt a mixture of pride and humility. "She's an outstanding pilot, sir. I was just doing my job as part of the team." "That's exactly the attitude we're looking for," Colonel Williams replied. "You've shown remarkable growth during this program." On the final day of training, the recruits gathered for their graduation ceremony and assignment announcements. Marcus had no idea where he would be posted, but he knew that wherever he went, he would be a better officer and a better person because of what he had learned. When his name was called, Marcus was surprised to hear that he had been assigned to an elite tactical training squadron. It wasn't the absolute top assignment in the class, but it was far better than he had expected given his early behavior. After the ceremony, General Collins approached him one final time. "Congratulations on your assignment, Lieutenant Thompson," she said, using his new rank. "Thank you, General, but I have to ask, why did you give me a second chance? You had every right to dismiss me from the program." General Collins considered the question carefully. "Because I've learned that some of the best officers are those who have faced their own flaws honestly and worked to overcome them. Your transformation during this program has been remarkable, but more importantly, it appears to be genuine." She paused, then continued. "The military needs officers who can adapt, learn, and grow. It needs people who can admit when they're wrong and work to make things right. You've proven you can do all of those things." Marcus felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "I promise you won't regret this decision, General." "I'm counting on it," General Collins replied. "But remember, this is just the beginning. The real test of your character will come when you're leading others and making decisions that affect their lives. As Marcus prepared to leave for his new assignment, he reflected on how completely his worldview had changed. The arrogant, prejudiced young man who had entered training just months before no longer existed. In his place stood someone who understood that true strength came from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Years later, as Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson led his own diverse squadron of pilots, he would often think back to that training program. He would remember the shame of his initial behavior, the shock of discovering Collins's true identity, and the long process of earning back the respect of his fellow officers. But most importantly, he would remember the lesson that had changed his life, that assumptions and prejudices are the enemy of excellence, and that the military's greatest strength has always been its ability to unite people from all backgrounds in service of something greater than themselves. When he told this story to younger officers facing their own challenges with diversity and inclusion, Marcus would always emphasize that real leadership meant recognizing the potential in everyone, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. The man who had once ridiculed female pilots had become one of their strongest advocates, and in doing so, had discovered what it truly meant to serve with honor.